Well, here it is. The end of Paragon The Overprime. Honestly, this is something that I wasn't expecting to cover or discuss, as I was busy working on a full video analysing and discussing the karma system. Just as I was finalising the draft, the developers announced that the game is shutting down, fully closing the servers on the 22nd of April. To be quite honest, ever since the announcement was made, I have been incredibly saddened to no end, as I felt like I finally found my game, a game that I could call my own. Like, I sunk so many hours into it, more than any other game I've ever played since I've been on PC, which has been for a while, mind you. It was also a game I was planning to take seriously in the long term by making content for it, sharing my opinions and analysing different mechanics to create a discussion throughout the community. But we can discuss my personal feelings in depth another time. Today, however, we are going to discuss and dissect some of the many reasons as to why the game was struggling, the constant uphill battle Overprime struggled with within its own identity, and the crippling gameplay and mechanical issues it was suffering from. If we are going to dive into such a massive and daunting topic, I think it's best if we start from the beginning of the game's release and then go from there with how things were handled in order for us to get the whole picture as to why the game is now being shut down. Without further ado, let's get started. In the early days of the game's lifespan, the release was quickly both an exciting and concerning launch for the community. When players downloaded the game and read the EULA they had to accept before playing, they quickly realized that the company behind the product was collecting massive amounts of private user data for their own personal use. Now, I don't have to tell you that a lot of people are obviously not comfortable with this at all, and this in and of itself already started to taint the game's public image and the trust of players who decided to try it out. This, coupled with the game's somewhat mediocre launch quality, both in terms of the game's unpolished state and the poor monetization of both heroes and their respective skins, Overprime already had a negative perception from both outsiders and those who played the game when it went into early access. Just from these first couple of issues alone on launch, had already put the game into the mixed reviews category. Let me tell you, that is not something you want to see when you're browsing and looking for a new game to play on Steam, especially if it's one that's new, because it's already looking messy from day one. You might just look elsewhere to find something else instead. This incredibly unpolished state continued, as shortly after Overprime was released, the game received its first couple of updates just before the holidays came around. The first update included a Christmas-themed event on the 14th that brought some new Christmas-themed skins and a snowy map, and the second one brought us our first new original hero, Xena. While these updates provided some well-needed content that aligned with the season that we were very much in, both of these patches only exemplified the bugs, glitches, performance issues, memory leaks, or even outright hard crashes that the game was already plagued with from the start. Now, it wouldn't have been a major point of contention if these types of issues were only out for a short amount of time, say like a couple of days or maybe even a week at most. But the problem here is that the game was left in that state for over a full month before getting any fixes for anything. And I know that sounds like a stretch, but I went back and looked at the patch notes and there it is. On the 19th of January, the first real patch that was released since the winter update finally addressed and fixed some of the issues that we were encountering. Sadly, this didn't even cover the issues that Xena brought into the mix herself, as when you used her ult, 90% of the time you would just teleport and fall through the map. And this wasn't even a case of where you could do something to get out of it. No, you were permanently stuck under it for the rest of the game. This meant you could lose entire matches due to game-breaking bugs and to no fault of your own. This, coupled with the inability to earn in-game currency on launch, outside of maybe one daily and one weekly challenge, this forced the developers to be more attentive and issue out more frequent hotfixes and patches in order to stabilize the game, such as making Rena earnable outside of challenges. Without getting too much into specifics about every single issue that the early access launch had or the EULA controversy, it was safe to say that this was already struggling to make a good first impression for players and to maintain player retention. Now, don't take my word for it, since numbers on Steam say it all. At launch, Overprime garnered around 32,500 players, but soon after, there was only around 4,000 left by the end of January. I mean, it's normal to lose a portion of your player base after the game is released, but 87.6% of all your players? This was also by the time they had pushed out any major fixes or improvements. Look, I've got to be honest here, this dealt a massive blow to the game's lifespan and whether or not it would even stick around in the long term. However, the small but dedicated community, myself included, was hopeful that the game would continue to exist someday and claw back a decent portion of the lost player numbers through more content updates, patches, and the release of the console version, which was expected to be launched within the next year or so in the future. I think at this point you get what I'm trying to say here. The game hadn't even been around a quarter of the year and was already struggling to keep players around, both in part to a lack of meaningful content and frustration due to the bugs and glitches that were very frequent. Another thing to quickly note before we move on is that shortly after release, a separate ranked matchmaking queue was in the game. Given the massive loss in player base, having two separate queues split what little players they had and caused matchmaking to become worse over time, especially as the game continued to bleed players over the coming months and resulted in more and more people refusing to play simply because of high wait times. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get on to the next section of this discussion, which is about the gameplay itself and the struggles the devs had with the balance of various different mechanics, like items, karmas, and even the heroes themselves. To start off, let's talk about the heroes themselves and how they were balanced. I've already made a video discussing this topic in great detail, so if you want a more in-depth explanation about this topic, I suggest watching that one, which I'll have linked on the top right card in the corner and in the description below. Anyway, to briefly summarize, there were so many character designs that were either way too simple, lacking any real depth to their overall playstyle, or were way too overloaded and ended up making some heroes much stronger than others. It very quickly became a case of, why pick X when Y is simply so much better? Unfortunately, we'll never see what future balance changes the developers had in mind, especially the upcoming reworks they had planned since, well, you know, the game is now dead. Now, let's move on to the items. Alongside the character that you picked, items are a very important part of any traditional MOBA. They allow for creative strategies and playstyles while also providing some very much needed depth and even viability for many of the characters in-game, and Overprime is of no exception to this. In the early days, items in the game weren't really unique or were very much in depth compared to other MOBAs like, say, League of Legends or Dota 2 or even Smite actually for that matter. They offered straightforward and simple stats with passives and actives that didn't really offer much in the way of build diversity. Every class pretty much felt like it had a standard build with a very few exceptions here and there. It was rather bland, to be honest with you. Over the duration of its first year into early access, however, they did add quite a few new items. Both major items and minor consumables to diversify the gameplay and allowed for some more theory crafting from the community for different types of builds. While balance issues were present, it was still an overall positive that more unique items were being added to the game. That all changed with one infamous patch. This update was the most infamous in the community of how controversial it was, as it sought the removal of active items and was replacing that system with the karma system. It essentially functioned very much like League's summoner spells or Smite's relics, but it was on steroids with insanely overtuned numbers and duration values. Oh, don't worry, we'll get into that issue very soon. In my opinion, this dumbed down the gameplay and fundamentally ruined the balance of power between heroes and the players themselves. Some of the characters in the game suffered massively and, for months afterwards, struggled to find any real relevance within their roles again. The two main ones that got the shortest end of the stick from this was both Steel and Decker. Before this update, they had a variety of different active items that gave them real power and presence, one item being Chain of Unity. Before it was removed from the game, it allowed the user to attach a link to an ally hero and take 20% of the damage they received onto themselves. Up until the day that they closed the development of the game, they never added any other item or karma spell back into the game that had the same effect. This and other items that offered unique actives sadly didn't make the cut in being transformed into karma spells, thus limiting the different ways of expression players had access to. The second main issue that arose from both new and old items were how they went about balancing the numbers and the passives that they offered. A prime example of such questionable balance can be seen with Spirit's armor. Initially, it was a simple item that had attack damage, attack speed, and a passive which removed the movement penalty debuff from basic attacks every time you hit an enemy, and that was it. Then, from out of nowhere, they changed it by adding 20% tenacity of all things to its overall stats. From what I remember, it was meant to be used by melee fighters like Crunch, Feng Mao, and Seraph. However, it gave ADCs more freedom and ways to empower and dominate almost any hero they were facing, alongside weakening the one true counterplay that marksmen had. Drongo in particular abused this item, which felt incredibly unfair to fight against even if he was behind. The community did end up pointing out such issues with adding seemingly random stats just to shake things up, but let me ask you, dear viewer, what do you think the developers did to rectify this issue? That's right, they added more stats to it, by slapping on an extra 2% movement speed and making it even better for carries to chase someone down without any issues whatsoever. Shortly after this, they did lower the tenacity amount to 10% as a means of adjusting the item, but by then the damage was already done. It soon became a staple pick on those who would abuse the item the best, mostly like ranged carries like say Yin or Drongo as mentioned before. Another issue worth bringing into conversation is how they handled vision and wards. At the time of writing, everyone has one vision ward that can detect other vision wards that are on a 90-second cooldown. This wasn't always the case, however, as before you had to spend gold in order to gain wards and place them around the map, creating a simple but unique dynamic with how players handled vision. This was a change that aimed to simplify the mechanic that I believed ended up harming the game overall, especially in competitive play. Vision is an incredibly important part of any traditional MOBA because it provides you with information. With this information, you can formulate different strategies on how you should play, such as being more aggressive or defensive. However, having such easy information that can be both acquired and denied removes some of the depth that Vision introduces. Having players buy wards for better map information control caused players to make conscious decisions on what they should spend their gold on, regardless of how cheap it may be, and made the acquisition of Vision a more risky but interesting part of the game. This issue was only exacerbated with the introduction of the Scout Ahead karma, which gave additional gold generation every few seconds, and gave the user up to 3 wards on top of the base free one, giving a user a total of 4 wards with no cost except for the recharge time itself. This changed the game to switch to something which I like to personally call Ward Wars. Imagine being a jungler who wants to play aggressive and help his solo laner with a hard matchup, only to then see every possible entry being covered by wards only because they took Scout Ahead. It was such a major issue that it was even being abused in competitive play, and it was never addressed by the devs. You'd often see 2 or even 3 players take this karma for vision superiority. If you were a support that wanted to provide vision to your team, your job was now much more difficult because not only could everyone easily disable your wards with no cost to them, but they could also have more wards than you at the start of the game with no cost to them. Since we're talking about the issue with Scout Ahead, let's finally talk about what I like to believe was the biggest cause of the game's downfall: the karma system. Man, oh man, where do I even begin with the problems that this brought to the game? I've already talked about Scout Ahead bringing its own set of problems, but that's just one of the many karmas that left a negative impact on the game. A prime example of what I'm talking about is the good old spell Demoralization, which, excuse my language here, brought some of the most bullshit and unfun gameplay I have ever experienced in a MOBA. On release, it would allow you to not only slow everyone around you by 45%, but also reduce both your physical and magical defense for 4 seconds. Even after it was introduced, it would go through so many changes that made it even more infuriating, like increasing the percentages, or, my personal favorite, increasing the duration to 7 seconds. Like, I cannot believe, are you fucking kidding me? Anyway, not only were the karmas themselves a big issue, but it was also their mere existence that caused so much strain and frustration. Unlike the active items that we mentioned before, these spells were available as soon as the game started. Many karmas did not scale up, whether that would have been through game time or player level. The only ones that I can personally remember that went with that ruling was Pain, Recovery, and Destruction, and even then they had their own share of balancing issues. Pain being chief among them. This meant that their high base numbers were available from level 1, for free, with no extra steps. This meant you could do stuff like take Courage at level 1, gaining 40% attack speed and movement speed and being able to outduel anyone else in the early game if they did not take it also themselves. Take Silence as a jungler and silence anyone you gank for 3 seconds, preventing any kind of escape. Or you could take both Weakened and Consolation and become the most oppressive laner imaginable by being able to reduce their damage while also increasing yours. Or if you're a solo laner, you can just take Scout Ahead and become the most ungankable in the whole game while also promoting no interaction from your lane opponent. Or if you suck at lane positioning, you could just take Teleportation and Charge and be able to run away from anything and everything that might be able to even kill you. So let me ask you, dear viewer, does any of this sound fun to you in a fight? If you said no, then congratulations, because everyone else thought the same as well. The thing is, it's not like this system couldn't work. One game you could point to that had a very similar system that did it right is Smite. Smite's relic system made it so you had one initial relic you could use, but you needed to get to level 12 before you're able to acquire a second one. Not only that, but you were also given the ability to upgrade them to a more powerful version of that same relic for 500 gold each, creating an important interaction whether the player had to decide on where to spend their gold. It was a thoughtful process into whether you delayed getting a complete item or spending the 500 gold for a possibly very useful relic that could either assist themselves or their allies during teamfights. Whereas in Overprime, that entire level of depth is just simply not there and gives players 2 fully powered karmas straight off the bat. No risk, no diminishing values, no requirements, not even proper scaling numbers based on different factors. You just had it right from the start. What about competitive play, you might ask? Diversity be damned. Just pick the strongest karma that patch had and have 3 to 4 players run it and watch the magic unfold. It was an awful implementation of the system, and the majority of the time they ended up being match winners on their own. I don't even need to bring up how Silence is a broken karma and shouldn't have existed even to begin with, or how utterly ridiculous Constellation was by giving insane amounts of both movement and attack speed, giving ADCs even more freedom and agency to chase targets. Alright. I think you get the picture of what I'm trying to paint here, in that the developers simply failed to understand how to balance a lot of these mechanics. From what it felt like, it was as if they were just throwing stuff at a wall and hoping something would have stuck. Honestly, it was a total disaster. And the worst part is that not only were they unbalanced, but they were also really not fun to play with or against. I do think with a bit more time and patience that they possibly could have struck a decent balance and the game could have ended up feeling more engaging and more in depth than what we ended up having before the game died off. Honestly, it's such a massive shame, to be honest. Now, with everything that I've spoken about up until this point, you would think that the issues would end there. After all, if there is one thing I can give Soul Leave credit for, is that they tried their damned hardest to balance out these systems and tested different changes through its consistent bi-monthly patches. But none of this would even matter if you're not going to get enough players to help sustain the game while you figure out what works and what doesn't. Any game developer understands how important this is, and skimping out on this will only lead to your project dying before it can thrive. That's right, I'm talking about marketing. When it comes to any product in the modern age, marketing is your greatest ally in spreading the word that you and what you're selling even exists and is something that you may want to even try out. It's a pivotal part in gaining momentum and building hype for the product in question and gets people talking. How many times have you seen a new and interesting game gets a new trailer dropped onto YouTube through various gaming media outlets such as IGN or GameSpot? And if it resonates with the majority of the viewers, it can end up snowballing into a massive hype train that gets everyone talking about it and spreading the word about the game that you made. I think a major one in the last few years or so that I can point to that blew up way past anyone else's expectations was the game Hytale. It was promising so many different features that Minecraft just sorely lacked, and it really spearheaded into its own thing with many interesting and engaging ideas and mechanics that would give long-time Minecraft players the feeling of being lost into a new and unknown world. Just like how they felt when they first booted up Minecraft back in its alpha and beta stages. For online multiplayer games, marketing is even more crucial, and it needs to be consistent so that not only new players can come play your game, but also bring back older players who may have stopped playing with new things such as content, events, game modes, and so on. This, however, was not something that Soul Leave or even Netmarble seemed to get right. In the beginning, different gaming outlets such as IGN and Game Trailers showcased the game going into early access, and they gained a lot of traction. Once again, they were able to accrue over 32,000 players at launch. That is incredibly massive, especially when you take into consideration their competitor, predecessor, had vastly less players due to gating their early access version behind a paywall. The ball was in their court. But then weeks, which turned into months, go by and there was nothing. No promotions that were widely spread for the game, no new events that would gauge interest for new and old players, and what social media presence they did have was incredibly weak, such as stopping their dev vlogs and only showcasing new skins being added to the game. I can't count how many comments I had on my TikToks that claimed that they didn't even know that Paragon was even alive and kicking, not even realizing that Overprime, or even predecessor for that matter, even existed. For some reason, neither Netmarble nor Souleve were even taking advantage of the fact that there was a void in the marketing area for a Paragon reboot, and never even once bothered to try and claim dominance in that field. The only advertising you could point to was either that of the partner creators that the developers partnered with, or the short and brief videos that got posted about the PlayStation beta test that they had coming up in the near future after the video, and that was it. For over a year, they made little to no real attempt to branch out and try and gain more players and grow their existence in the MOBA genre, and just stayed in their own corner, slowly bleeding players and dying a slow and painful death until eventually it came to its shutdown in April. For content creators like myself and others in the community, it generally felt like they were dropping the ball hard on us, and it seemed like they were neglecting a major factor in what makes a game widely recognizable and sustainable. Instead, they solely relied on word of mouth from the small number of players that they still had left. Partners eventually came to the conclusion, however, that they did in fact have a marketing team and they were advertising the game for them. It was us, the partner creators of the game itself. Now, don't get it twisted, I do generally believe that having a certain level of communication between the people who make videos and stream the game is, in this day and age, a vital part of keeping in touch with what the community wants to see. They were desperately hoping that we would be able to keep the game alive practically for free without having to shell out tens of thousands or even upwards of millions of dollars for possibly little to no gain in new players for the game in question. However, there is only so much us content creators can do for a game, especially with how new and small Paragon The Overprime was. There is a massive difference between a content creator's reach and the reach you can get from a paid expert. It seemed to many of us that we were their marketing, and they thought that they didn't need to pay for advertisement as we were doing it for them in exchange for some in-game bonus rewards, such as access to private test builds of upcoming patches with new items, modes, and heroes, plus a monthly payment of premium currency to keep us incentivized to carry on pumping out more streams and videos about the game. This was the straw that broke the camel's back in my opinion, as this was a huge mistake on their part, as no one in the community had any kind of major reach or popularity to do what they thought we could. The most of any of the channels had was maybe a couple of thousand subs or an average of 50-60 viewers on their streams. One such partner was Cordy, as he was considered one of the main content creators for Overprime content throughout its entire lifespan, and he had about 3,000 subs before the game was declared dead. Both Netmarble and Souleve were insanely underestimating the need for them to pay for marketing and advertisement for the game. I personally believe that this is one of the major reasons that the game never grew and instead slowly ended up dying from. Finally, let's discuss the last topic that I believe really hindered the developers' focus, which is the poor misuse and utterly ridiculous amounts of wasted resources and time that was used on different things such as game modes, mechanical changes, and map modifications that never ended up seeing the light of day. In the official Overprime Discord server, we would get screenshots and teasers of things to come so that we could draw some excitement from them. But rather than creating hype, it seemed more likely that they were just blowing smoke up the community's ass to try and keep people interested while bearing zero results for what they were showing off. Let's look at the first new mode that they announced that was never released publicly to the community, Murdoch in Wonderland. This game mode's premise was that everyone played Murdoch and only had his ultimate unlocked, with it being on a 1-second cooldown, and you had to outsnipe other enemy players, and the first 25 kills wins the game. This was teased by the dev team as their first additional game mode to be playable during early access, and was able to be shown off by the partner creators at the time due to them having access to the test server. This mode was an interesting idea, but even after being on the testing branch for the longest time, it actually never even saw the light of day and was quickly forgotten about in the coming months from then on. This could have been one of the many modes of rotation during the weekdays or even on the weekends to keep things fresh and keep players interested in the long term, but it never happened. This isn't even the first time this has happened either, as shortly after they left Murdoch in Wonderland's corpse in the sun to rot, they rushed over to chase a trend by making another game mode based around the Battle Royale genre, but with a MOBA twist on it. This was called Abandoned Storage. I was personally against this as it made zero sense to add that kind of mode to a MOBA of all things. This also, once again, went onto the test server to give people some live gameplay from the partners and make sure everything was working and balanced correctly before being added to the main game. But, once again, this simply did not happen. Instead, it just fell into obscurity and was never mentioned or even added to the game in the end. And then the third and final game mode which we're going to look at, which praise be did in fact go to the live branch, is called Red Moon. This mode was simply ARAM, but in Overprime instead, and was actually quite a lot of fun. The games were short, fast-paced, and were quite easy to find since a lot of people were really happy to finally have a second mode added to the game since the release. However, this unfortunately did not last long, as the mode was only available for about 2 or 3 weeks before being removed from the game and was not even playable anymore. Not even in custom games, which was a very weird thing to also disable. I mean, let's think about this for a minute. They had 3 new modes worked on throughout the entirety of the game's lifespan, and only one even made it to the public branch for anyone to play. Suffice to say it, but the development time and resources spent on them was simply not worth it, except for Red Moon, as this could have been rotated in and out during the weekend to be played and help boost player numbers and retention times for the game. These modes were not the only pieces of content that never made it into the game, as there were many other smaller things that were discussed many times, and even in some cases teased, but ultimately never ended up materializing anything substantial. Things you could point to in this instance are things like a second tower being added to every lane to slow down the game a bit and put more focus on the laning phase during the first 10 or 12 minutes, or the entire sprint mechanic possibly being removed to make the game's controls simpler for new players and slowing down the game's pacing. Or how the main lead developer, Ranger, was going on about loving the Agora map and even possibly adding not only that map to the game, but also a range of different maps to a test server and then picking the most popular one to add to the game shortly thereafter. In the end, this isn't even all of the examples you could find where the development team was constantly teasing new and exciting features that they were working on, only for them never to be released, wasting company time, manpower, and resources that could have been used for more important matters. Like the issues I've mentioned previously in this video. There are even files in the game that people data mined showing that they were working on even more than what they showed off, like this city map here, or this marble-based map, or even this weird banner system that they would have had in each base to what I could only assume is to display esports teams' logos during official tournaments. Or, God forbid, a way to inject ads into the game like the Hyundai one you see in the image here. Only one could really speculate. Right, I've been going on about this for a while now, but I think you get the point. The game was suffering for so many different reasons, but the points I made in this video were only a tip of the iceberg when it comes to the amount of problems this game suffered from. I made a bullet point list before writing out the script and trying to organize my thoughts about this whole thing, and it came to over 22 bullet points about various parts of the game that had issues. And if I try to make a video with those sections covering each topic from one bullet point to the next, this video would have ended up being about 1 to 2 hours in length at the very least. And let's be real here, there isn't much point putting that much effort into a video about a game when it probably won't even reach the players that played the game up until its untimely demise, since the developers deleted the general chat from their Discord server and prevented anyone from adding any new forum posts or adding additional links in their video channels. So I'm assuming this video will get lost into YouTube's algorithm, but I still at least wanted to cover and archive some level of Paragon The Overprime to try and summarize why it ended up going nowhere in the end. Is it a fool's errand to put this much effort into a video about a dead game? Yeah, you may be right, but I loved this game a lot, and for the brief time it had been around to be played and enjoyed, I had a blast with it. I just wish it stayed around longer and got the attention it deserved, and who knows, maybe it could have even coexisted in the same space with the other MOBAs, but we'll never know. Anyway guys, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed me covering this rollercoaster ride of ups and downs, and if you liked what you saw, why not throw a like my way and subscribe to let me know. If you have any personal opinions as to why the game died, leave a comment down below and share your thoughts. But with that said, I'm gonna go and dive into hell and fight for freedom and democracy. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.